What's good, YouTube? Today we've got a ranged DPS tier list for Season 2 of Dragonflight. Like I mentioned with the melee tier list we did yesterday, the meta is seeming to settle down, so we're going to go over the ranged specs today, and we're also going to rate them against their melee counterparts. So the first spec that we're going to start off is the Balanced Druid, and I thought this spec was going to struggle a lot coming into Season 2 from Season 1 because they lost their Giga tier set that they had in Season 1, and the tier set they have this season isn't too hot. However, Balanced has yet again surprised everyone, I'm pretty sure. They are pumping out some ridiculous sustained AoE DPS, and they also have some very respectable single target damage as well, especially when it comes to burst single target. But the main selling point of the Balanced Druid is that sustained AoE damage that you can really benefit from in those higher keys once the mobs start living longer. They also have much less ramp this season because they don't have to spread out those stellar flares anymore. They can just get their dots up, pray for an Astral Smolder proc, and then start spamming those Starfalls. Balanced Druid is a very tanky spec. They have Bark Skin on a very short cooldown. They've got Nature's Vigil, which can also be used as utility for your group. And of course, they can always drop into bear form whenever they need to. They also boast some of the best utility in the game. They've got their Trents, although I haven't seen one Balanced Druid talent into that in Dragonflight. They have multiple AoE stops in Typhoon and also in Cap Roar, and they can also pair that with a Vortex, or you could use this to help out your tank. They are also relatively helpful when it comes to the new affix as well. They can deal with Afflicted very well. However, they can't really deal that well with Incorporeal, and obviously they can shapeshift every single entangling. So for that reason, the Balanced Druid is going straight to the top of S tier. This spec you really cannot fault in any regard. It's got crazy damage output, it's very tanky, and it also, like I said, brings some of the best utility in the game for Mythic Plus. Next, we move on to another very strong spec for this season. We have the Devastation Evoker. They got a very strong tier set coming into this season. It's doing about 10% of their overall damage in keys at the moment. They have insane damage, whether it's AoE or single target. It really does not matter what the encounter is. They have arguably the best upfront burst in the game thanks to their mastery, and this is a very nice damage profile for Mythic Plus. It would definitely help if they could reduce their threat though. So in terms of raw output, they are also probably one of the better damage dealers that can bring lust to your group. And the best part is the rotation is a simple rotation as well, so you can focus more so on the boss mechanics or the trash mechanics or any CC that you need to do. They bring some great utility to Mythic Plus too. They've got their Drakthir racial abilities that can interrupt mobs. They've got a pressing roar, which in a coordinated setting can prove very potent. You can pair this up with a lot of other CC and just completely lock down packs. They have Zephyr to help your group out if you're all about to take a massive chunk of damage. They have Cauterizing Flame as well, which can be very nice for any bleed dispels you need. And finally, they just passively off-heal your group with their Living Flame, but they can also provide some nice passive off-healing on demand. The only thing drawing back the Evoker, like we all know, is their defensive capabilities. They do have 2 charges of their Hardened Scales, reducing their damage taken by 30%. And they also have Renewing Blades, which is a very strong cooldown if used in the right scenario. However, apart from this, they don't really have anything else, so they do struggle in comparison to other classes. That being said though, with the insane damage they're putting out and some of the nice utility that they do bring to your group, I'm going to whack this spec in the top of A tier. I was about to say the bottom of S, but I think I've just changed my mind. It could easily be argued that this spec is an S tier spec, but for now we're going to place it in the A tier. We don't want the S tier getting too clogged up now, do we? Onto a spec that's definitely not going to clog up the S tier this season. It's the Beast Mastery Hunter. BM has just received a 5% buff, so that is definitely helping them with their damage. Don't get me wrong though, the AoE from the Beast Mastery Hunter is very strong. Don't sleep on it. But unfortunately, in a light cleave scenario and also even on single target, surprisingly, BM is struggling to keep up. It's not awful by any means, it is respectable, but it's just not up there with the greats. You have a lot more uptime on your Bestial Wrath this season, so this is contributing to a lot more just overall consistent damage that the BM Hunter was already bringing. And honestly, I wouldn't say BM is that squishy anymore. We've had some survivability buffs over the course of Season 1, and going into this season, defensively, we are pretty strong. We've got this Fortitude of the Bear, we've got Survival of the Fittest, we've got Turtle, we've got Feign Death, which can be used to avoid certain mechanics, and you've got your Exhilaration on like a 1-minute cooldown. You also have some extra passive HP, so BM is kind of a tanky spec now, I would argue. It doesn't bring the greatest utility in the world. The utility is very niche from hunters in general. We can bring lust to the group, and BM doesn't really suffer from using a lust pet, although we don't get the leech value from it. But you do have binding shot, which can be an AoE stun if your tank needs to kite, and you can also single target stun with intimidation. You have your traps as well for any extra CC you need. So I do feel like BM is being quite underrated this season, so I'm going to prop it up a little bit. Not too much though. We're still going to put it in the B tier. I think I'm just going to put it just in front of the Frost DK for now, but behind Windwalker and Survival. Like I said in the melee tier list, Survival is looking to be the best hunter spec. Moving on to the final hunter spec, then we have the Marksmanship Hunter. Marksmanship does have some insane AoE burst and single target burst, but unfortunately the AoE burst does fall off in those higher keys once mobs start living longer. They bring some pretty nutty single target though. With the uptime on their True Shot from their Windrunner's Guidance that they're now talenting into, they have some insane uptime on their True Shot. They can have True Shot for anywhere up to like 70% of a fight if they're lucky, and can provide some insane single target DPS. However, they are a squishy spec. They are definitely squishier than Beast Mastery Hunter and also even Survival because you don't run a leech pet. So I do feel like MM Hunters fall over the most out of all of the hunter specs, unfortunately. They also don't bring as much utility as the other hunter specs do. They lack an intimidation from their pet. It's also very, very awkward to lust as an MM Hunter, especially if you're pugging. It's almost impossible because you have to precast that Dismiss pet. And with pug tanks, you never know when they're going to pull. So that can really mess up your opener. However, it's not too much to worry about. And so just in general, I think the Marksmanship Hunter is worse than both of the other hunter specs. I'm probably still going to put it in the same tier because it is not an awful spec. I'm just going to put it at the very bottom of the B tier. Onto the Arcane Mage, probably the hardest spec to play in Mythic Plus, pulling off that damage rotation perfectly to get that massive burst, and having the mobs live enough for that massive burst as well is almost impossible to ask. They are very, very cooldown reliant, and also their tier sit doesn't really cater towards Mythic Plus, so that's an L for them there. That being said, they do have some of the best bursts in the game, so they will delete those bosses. They might be handy for tyrannical weeks, but even then, I probably wouldn't bring one. They're also relatively tanky as a mage. They have their barriers, they also have their ice block, and also Alter Time, which if used effectively can be a very potent defensive cooldown. They bring an intellect buff to your group, but outside of that, they don't bring too much utility to your group, especially as Arcane. And just generally, the other mage specs are going to perform much, much better in Mythic Plus, and so for that reason, I'm out. And I'm going to put this one at the bottom of C tier, unfortunately. Sorry, Arcane Mages. On to probably the best mage spec this season then, we have the Fire Mage. On big AoE pulls, they have some of the best AoE damage in the game, especially when paired with a Power Infusion, but we won't take that into account. And they also have a very desired damage profile for Mythic Plus, being able to feed all of that damage into a priority target and just passively cleave on everything around it. You really cannot go wrong with that damage profile. Fire Mage always tends to scale very well with secondary stats as well, so that's played into its favor into this season. And with the uptime on combustion these days, I really don't think Fire is that reliant on how the group or tank pulls, although Fire is definitely going to be noticeably better on higher keys when the mobs live longer and their ignite can actually spread and tick. If they do talent into Cauterize, which you probably would in the highest of keys, you are definitely the tankiest mage spec. You have block as well, you have your barriers, Alter Time like I mentioned for the Arcane Mage too. I did forget to mention this for Arcane, but as a mage you are one of the classes that can bring lust to your group, so that's always going to help you, especially when you're pugging. You have the intellect buff like I've mentioned. Dragon's Breath is a nice AoE stop, but as a Fire Mage you're still not bringing the best utility in the game. So I don't think I can put it in the S tier this season, but it's very, very close. In previous seasons when the damage was much larger, then it would probably warrant an S tier placing, but for this season we're going to whack it in the top of A tier. I am so undecided whether to put it in front or behind the Devastation Evoker. I think I'm going to put it in front. It's got better defensives. It brings slightly more utility maybe, especially for a caster comp. But don't worry too much about these placings. I think either of these two could easily be at the top of A tier. On to the final mage spec then, we have the Frost Mage, which have amazing single target damage and also light cleave thanks to their tier set. They bring some really nice priority damage as well, which is always very valuable in Mythic Plus. However, you could argue that they are kind of reliant on how the tank or group pulls for their Icy Veins uptime, as a lot of their damage comes from inside their cooldowns. Frost is again another tanky spec of the mage. You could argue either way for if Fire or Frost are more tanky. Frost obviously has access to double block, so that plays into its favor, but it doesn't have Cauterize. However, you do actually bring some extra utility as the Frost mage because you pretty much have a permanent slow on all of the mobs at all times. Your tanks will love you, and if they ever need to kite, they can do whenever they please. Again, they're bringing Lust, Arcane Intellect, and the other defensives that I mentioned for the other two specs. So I think Frost Mage is deserving of a high B tier. It's just not quite as good as Fire this season. Next, we'll go on to the Shadow Priest, which is easily the best DPS in Mythic Plus at the moment, and also brings probably the best utility for Mythic Plus 2. We're whacking this straight at the top of S tier. No questions asked. Next spec. I'm joking. It's got some great single target damage that translates directly into AoE on up to 12 targets through their Psychic Link. Again, an amazing damage profile where they can funnel all of their main damage into a priority target and nuke it down. Their AoE's also been helped with the burst from Shadow Crash. They no longer have to manually apply their dots. They just send out a Shadow Crash and start feeding damage and then spreading that through their Psychic Link. I can't put this spec at the top of S tier without mentioning the infamous Power Infusion. This cooldown accounts for so much damage in your overall keys. It's an absolutely busted cooldown that the Shadow Priest brings, and I'm pretty sure we'd all agree that we don't want it in the game, but it seems like they're leaning even more into that with the Augmentation Evoker that's coming out soon, TM. They bring some great utility to the group as well outside of their Power Infusion. They have Mass Dispel, which is nice for your bursting weeks. They have Power Word Fortitude, which is going to really help out in those higher keys where that health difference really can make an impact. And they have some ridiculous off healing with their Vampiric Embrace cooldown. The only thing the Shadow Priest does suffer from is a long cooldown on their kick, but I'm pretty sure we can look past that from the rest of their kit. The Elemental Shaman gained a lot of damage going into Season 2. Their tier set has really helped them out getting those free Stormkeepers. When played well, you could definitely see an Elemental Shaman at the top of your overall meters. They really do have some incredible AoE potential and also not too bad single target either. And I do feel like generally the Elemental Shaman is slept on in Mythic Plus. They have a very bursty damage profile, which is always desirable for Mythic Plus, and they also bring some insane utility to your group as well. You have your Earthquake knockdowns. They also have access to Thundershock now, as well as your Cap Totems, which can both be used as AoE interrupts. And they also provide the shortest kick in the game, which is going to be especially helpful this season with the range comps we're seeing. Even more utility to note, they have Ancestral Guidance as very powerful off healing, and also you have the Earth Elemental if your tank ever needs the help. This Earth Elemental is also going to grant you some extra health, which you're going to take whenever you can, because unfortunately the Elemental Shaman, much like all the Shaman specs, are very squishy. You're really going to suffer when you're taking constant damage, so that is going to hold them back, I'm afraid. However, they're still going to be placed quite highly on this tier list. I'm going to whack the Elemental Shaman in the A tier just behind the Fury Warrior. It is unfortunately not as good as Enhancement, but it very much does the job. Affliction Warlock can do decent single target or AoE damage, but unfortunately they do have to talent into the correct build, and it's just generally the worst of all the lock specs, so there's not really a scenario where you would ideally want to play one. They're a really tanky spec. We all know how tanky Warlocks are coming into Dragonflight, and they also bring some nice utility to your group. You can provide your group with some health stones. You have demonic gateways for any niche skips that you find. You've got your curses, you've got your mortal coil, and also an AoE stun in Shadow Fury. Unfortunately, that's not going to be quite enough for the Affliction Warlock, so we are going to place this at the bottom of the tier list for now. It's a C tier for the AF. Moving on to Demonology Warlock then, they do have some incredible single target and AoE throughput. I think a lot of people did overrate this spec coming into this season because their tier set on paper looks giga chad, but it's not quite putting out those insane numbers. That being said, they are still doing very, very respectable overalls. They also boast some really nice cleave damage, which we're seeing a lot of in the dungeons in Season 2, and they're also a very, very nice PI recipient. They are tanky AF as well. They've got their Soul Leech, you've got your Demon Skin, Unending Resolve, you've got your Dark Pact on a short cooldown as well. They really, really are very tanky. They generally bring the same utility as an Affliction Warlock. The only thing that can be said is their interrupt is also a stun, which can be very annoying if you need to interrupt a mob outside of the pack. You can't really interrupt it as a demo warlock because you're just going to stun it out there and it's not going to come in to get cleaved down. And I would like to mention for the Demonology Warlock and the Destruction Warlock, they are very interchangeable with each other. Obviously they're on the same class, so in some dungeons Intelligence Destro might perform better, but also Demonology might perform better in others. So I'm going to whack the Demo Lock just behind the Elemental Shaman in the A tier. Last but by no means least, we have the Destruction Warlock. They have some incredible single target damage, so they're really going to nuke down those bosses in Mythic Plus. They also arguably have some of the best mass AoE in the game as long as they can ramp. However, that being said, this season there isn't heaps of mass AoE, so they can't really shine like they did in Season 1. They are a spec that's quite reliant on how the tank or group pulls, like I've just mentioned about the mass AoE. If they don't have massive pulls constantly, they're not going to deal insane amounts of damage. So that can definitely hurt the spec because they aren't great on light cleave of targets up to about 5. And like I briefly stated, they do need a bit of ramp, so in those higher keys they are going to perform that much better because they can get those Rain of Fires churning and deal their great AoE damage. Again, they're bringing the same utility as the Demonology and Affliction Warlock, so I'm not going to go over that too much. They're also very, very tanky as a Warlock spec. The only extra utility they do bring is they don't get any diminishing returns on their stuns from their Blasphemy or their Infernal, so that is a really nice extra as an AoE stun. So I'm going to put the Destro Warlock just in front of Demonology, but like I said, these are very interchangeable if you're playing a Warlock in general. And even in the tier list itself, you could even put Demonology in front, but for now, we're going to place the Destro in front. So that is my ranged tier list or overall tier list for Season 2 of Dragonflight for Mythic Plus. I don't think there's any arguments in having the Shadow Priest and Boomkin up the top, and also I can't see too many people arguing about Affliction being at the bottom. Let me know down in the comments below what you guys think of my tier list, whether you agree with it, what specs you would change around. While you're down there, leave a like if you did enjoy this video and also subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.